probably many years ago, I would have called myself a feminist, but prior to working for the university, I spent 20 years working in the community services sector in Tasmania with a lot of feminists, and I did manage a feminist service in Launceston for a while, and it was the most toxic workplace I had ever worked in. And I've, certainly seen this narrative build around man-hating, and only women can be the good ones and men are always bad. So that's always bothered me. And so it's something I'm very adamant about. And I made it very clear when I took this job on. I actually said in my interview, I'm not a feminist, and I won't teach something that goes against what I believe in.
Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Fiona Girkin in Tasmania. Hello, Fiona.
Hi, how you going?
I'm really good. I'm very happy to have you here. We should call you Dr. Girkin because you recently got your PhD.
Yes, I have. Yeah. It's still hard to get used to.
I can imagine. Now, I want to tell you about how you originally approached me saying you would be interested in talking about your role teaching police about domestic violence in Tasmania. Can you tell me about what you're doing here?
Yeah, definitely. I work for the University of Tasmania, helping the Tasmanian police learn about domestic and family violence. So I teach police recruits as well as police going for promotion from the university perspective. So we work in tangent with the police academy to teach the police.
Yeah. And what interested me is when you first approached me, it was very obvious you weren't part of what I would regard as the feminist cabal, which is pushing feminist ideology into our justice system. I think you said something about, thanked me for being willing to protect men from women who seek to destroy their lives. So you're from a different place. Is that right?
Yeah. Look, probably many years ago, I would have called myself a feminist, but prior to working for the university, I spent 20 years working in the community services sector in Tasmania with a lot of feminists, and I did manage a feminist service in Launceston for a while, and it was the most toxic workplace I had ever worked in. And I've, certainly seen this narrative build around man-hating, and only women can be the good ones and men are always bad. So that's always bothered me. And so it's something I'm very adamant about. And I made it very clear when I took this job on. I actually said in my interview, I'm not a feminist, and I won't teach something that goes against what I believe in.
I was most intrigued by that. I think we'll do a second interview, Fiona, if you don't mind, talking about your experiences and what was actually a sexual assault service you were involved in. And because it led to you writing your thesis on feminist psychopaths. Because you discovered there was that sort of psychopathology in the community services sector. I think that's a terrific topic, and I'd love to come back to it. But I want to talk more about the domestic violence territory now. Would you be happy to talk about that at a later stage?
Yeah, definitely. I do love talking about female psychopaths. It's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I know. I'm very interested in your position now in as part of the justice system, teaching police and taking a different perspective, resisting the push for feminist ideology and wanting to tell the truth to these police that you're involved in about what domestic violence is all about. So you're challenging the believe all women line. Tell me so you're teaching the facts. Tell me what you teach them.
Yeah, of course. So I'm really adamant about saying to the police that, yes, the stats do show that there's a gender imbalance when it comes to domestic violence, but I want you to go into the home when you get called out and not look at gender, but look at behaviour. And of course, in most circumstances, they're going to find that if it's a physical violence situation, often it is the male, but I want them to go in and look at behaviour, not at gender, because I think that can bias how they view the situation. And given that's such a strong narrative out there in the world, I'm really particular about not being biased. The other thing I do in my slides is I always make sure I put both lots of stats, male victims, female victims, female perpetrators, male perpetrators. So a lot of my stats actually just have a question mark where it says male, especially in Tasmania. When it comes to male victims, I just put male and a question mark because there's actually no stats that I can locate around male victims of domestic violence, certainly in Tasmania.
Because no one's interested in gathering those statistics. But you,
Yeah.
uh, but you do teach them also about the international research showing, that in most violent homes, most males and females are violent. Women often instigate violence. I mean, the data is well and truly out there. Uh,
Mm.
Trying to get that through to the police.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is it hasn't been as big of a task as I expected because what I'm hearing from police that have been around for a long time and police that are, out there at the moment is that they're seeing just as many women as they are men in domestic violence situations as the perpetrator. It's not males that are the offenders, it's equally both men and women. And that's something that's certainly coming back from all levels of policing that they're telling me, which I thought was really interesting, and it's not what I expected when I started this role.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very encouraging that um, even that the police are willing to talk to you about that and say that's what we're seeing. But you're also finding that that women are being charged. And your impression is that plenty of women are being charged with domestic violence or coercive control in Tasmania. Is that right?
Look, women are certainly being arrested. As you know, for that next step, I can't really speak to that because
No,
I'm sort of
okay.
not involved in that. But women are certainly being arrested and taken to the station to be assessed as perpetrators. And I think that's happening, like I said, 50% of the time because it depends on the situation. And when the police go in, I mean, they have to analyse the situation based on what they're seeing when they're there. They can't spend 2 hours talking to them about, child trauma and, all those little bits and pieces. They have to go in and assess that incident. And if in that incident it's the woman that is being um, violent in some way, whether that's emotional or physical, she needs to be arrested because that's the process. And then it is later assessed at a higher level once back at the station.
Yeah. But I mean, it's interesting. I sent to you an article I'd found, which was a couple of years old, 2023, from the ABC, which of course has a particular spin on this issue, as they do on most issues. But they were complaining that women are being misidentified as perpetrators in Tasmania and said
Mm,
it's a real problem because often these women are charged and then these charges are overturned in the courts. And that there's been a big increase in this process in women being charged and then the magistrates throwing that out, which is fascinating because it would suggest that
mm,
the magistrates are taking, I suspect there are more and more female magistrates out there. This is what we're hearing. And they are very reluctant to allow women to be identified as perpetrators.
mm,
But I mean, that does support what you're saying, that certainly at the police end, they are doing, you're saying they're doing proper assessment. They are
mm,
looking at the evidence. They're raising questions about, you know, what does the evidence suggest about who's the perpetrator? And they actually, can you just describe that system? You have a process where, to make the final decision about it, whether the women are charged, senior officers always involved, the evidence is presented, blah, blah, blah. You
mm.
tell us a bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So once the officers go out to the property, usually it's a home, they arrest the person, they take them back to the station, and then it's a sergeant that actually makes the decision as to whether that person is charged or not. So it's not, we have a lot of young recruits, new recruits in Tasmania, so it's not someone that doesn't understand domestic violence that's making that final decision. And then they make this decision on the ground, but then it's a sergeant that makes the decision as to whether that person's charged. If that person is charged, then it goes to the family violence specialist unit in
Yeah.
Hobart. And in that unit, they actually bring all government services together and look at a lot of other information. So they look at school records of children, they look at child protection, they look at other justice records, and they actually look at the bigger picture. So it's not a matter of just going, oh, there was one incident, we charged this person. They actually look at the bigger picture, which I'm really stoked about, that they're actually not just going, okay, we'll just quickly give this person an order. They're actually looking at the whole holistic approach to what's really happening in this home and who's really at risk.
Yep. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating because
Mm,
that's what you would want to happen. That the evidence is looked at by people who know what they're doing and a proper evaluation is made.
mm.
Um, Now, I mean, this just suggested that our deep south, Tasmania, we have a little, I can't even think how to describe it. Part of our community is resisting the feminist push to only believe women, to
Mm.
introduce all this feminist ideology into our justice system. And Tasmania seems to be the standout, and I think that's extraordinary. I mean, you get
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
the police you're working with and the police authorities are, are doing the right thing and are supporting your work in teaching the truth to
yeah.
police about rather than ideology to the police force.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the. I had an inspector actually at my initial interview when I took this role on over 12 months ago now. And apparently, my boss told me after we got off the interview, he said, I want her because he knew what I'd done my PhD in and that I was willing to look at both sides of the story. He knew that I was willing to look at women who are abusive as well, and not just make assumptions based on gender, which I think is really, really important and really important to them because they're trying to do the best they can when they've got the feminine, overarching feminist approach that's really quite concerning because it can be very aggressive. I found that some of the previous teachings were extremely critical and aggressive towards the police and the process. So I'm really conscious of not doing that. I don't think we teach anybody anything by yelling at them and tell them how bad they've done. I think it's about, acknowledging the hard work that they do with such little information. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, but it is extraordinary because I mean, I know you've been reading what I've been writing about Queensland, and I've
mm,
interviewed two Queensland police officers who talk about the enormous pressure they're under to only charge men, to use the domestic violence, the whole domestic violence charges to have them weaponized against men. And we've recently they're implementing crazy laws which will allow men to just, the police to just hand out domestic violence protection orders like
mm.
parking tickets. I mean, the push is on across Australia to use domestic violence as a means of destroying men's lives. And Tasmania doesn't seems to be resisting this, even though, as you say, in Tasmania, if you read the local papers and if you look at what the ABC is saying, and the narrative is very much pushing the feminist line that it's all men.
Mm. And I think because, the majority of funding goes to feminist services who
Yep,
support women who are victims,
yep,
there's not a lot of support out there for men. And I think it's that data that's then being used by media and government to say, look, this is the problem that we've got. I think the other problem is that we refuse to see women as perpetrators. We see a woman who perpetrates violence as someone protecting themselves. Whereas if a man's protecting himself, we never say, oh, he was protecting himself. We say, oh, he's violent. So I think that gender split stops us from looking at the actual behavior and actually what's going on. And that's probably the thing that bothers me the most is that we make a lot of excuses for women when women can be extremely manipulative and extremely harmful, both in their own social groups, but also to men in relationships.
I mean, you mentioned to me how, you in your training with the police, you might use scenarios where you act out or, show them various situations and you ask the police who are there to comment on, what would they do? Who would they charge? How would they react? Can you give me an example of how you do that?
Yeah, so one of the things we do with the police recruits once they've done all the domestic violence training is we do a scenario. We have two police come in and be the victim and the perpetrator. And sometimes that can be a man and a woman, sometimes it could be two women. We haven't done two men yet, but we've certainly done two women. We then give them a scenario as though the radio room has called them and given them this incident. They go in and they have to assess the situation and decide one, whether to arrest someone and who to arrest. And it's really interesting to watch when we mix up the gender. And certainly when we had two women, that I think confused the recruits a little bit. And you got to remember, these recruits are 18, 19, 20. A lot of them are very young and don't have the life experience to look beyond what they're seeing. But it's really quite fascinating. We had one recently where we had a male victim and a female perpetrator, and the male victim was actually being quite aggressive in his way of acting out the role, and it actually confused the recruits. And in the end, they didn't know who to arrest, even though it was the female who had threatened her male partner. When came together privately to discuss who they were going to arrest, they said, well, we don't know who to arrest, so maybe we'll just arrest him. And I was horrified and said to them, please don't ever do that. Please look at the behaviours. You don't know, ask more questions. But it's clear that, and it's not anything to do with the teaching, it's the social messages that are out there in the public that even if you haven't listened to stuff about domestic violence, people hear it all the time, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of the feminist messages are utterly distorting the truth about what, is this critical social issue. I mean, I'll be the first to acknowledge that we have a very serious issue at the heart of this, which is women needing protection from violent
Yes.
men. But the notion that it's in every house in Australia, that it's across the board equally common in higher income houses, I mean, all of that is an absolute distortion. There are particularly groups that are particularly vulnerable. There are sectors of our society where we have a much higher incidence of domestic violence. So one of the things you were telling me about in Tasmania is you have parts of the community which have very high incidence of drug and alcohol problems, mental illness and so on, problematic families where you're seeing 3 and 4 generations of domestic violence problems emerging. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we have certain addresses that the police actually know quite well. They've attended multiple times over the last 20, 30 years. They might have initially seen the parents and now they're seeing the kids of the kids that are being violent in the home. You've got to think of Tasmania like a small country town. Everybody knows everybody. There's drug and alcohol issues, employment issues, and it becomes quite generational because the drug and alcohol issues are a massive problem in terms of violence in Tasmania. But yeah, there are certain homes that the police know quite well. And I say that to the recruits, be prepared that there's certain addresses you'll get to know and that you will attend regularly and nothing will change. And that's what bothers me the most, I think, is that why aren't we putting money into these families that have become generationally abusive to try and break that cycle?
Yeah, well, of course, we do nothing about that. And even though we've had expert witnesses trying to point out that these problems like drug and alcohol are absolutely central to the causes of domestic violence, they get ignored. And all the money goes towards the feminist, ideas around it's all about gender inequality, it's all about shaming boys in schools, and the billions of dollars are being now spent on that. As you're finding, the police know that there are these problem families and nothing is being done to support them or to monitor them more carefully or to deal with the alcohol problems, whatever it is. I mean, it's just appalling how blinkered our domestic violence industry has been and how deliberately they're avoiding dealing with the real problems as you're finding.
Yeah, and I've noticed that having come from the community sector into the sort of policing realm now, there's a real disconnect between the community sector and those feminist services and the police.
Yeah.
I've done a bit of data analysis for some services where I've noticed that there's been no referrals back and forth between police and the service, which I thought was quite interesting. So there is a real disconnect between the two.
You also sent me some research, some data showing that if you look at violence, the violence is allegedly increasing. But when you look carefully and pick that data apart, the incidents that are increasing are all at the low end, low risk end, right? And the high risk end has remained largely static. So real violence, physical violence, has probably been really static because what the data is now picking up is, people shouting at each other or getting upset about a credit card bill or not being paid, or, there's all these expanded definitions of violence, including coercive control, are what's absolutely dominating, the whole industry and maintaining the idea that we have a real problem here, whereas the problem of physical violence is probably not changing very much.
No, and I think, I think I'd be confident to say that it's probably actually decreasing the physical side of the
Yeah.
violence. But there are a portion, a small portion of extremely toxic, violent relationships that, the perpetrator needs to be imprisoned. But I think, you throw a bigger net, you catch more fish, don't you? And I think as we keep expanding the definition, at some point, everybody's relationship's going to come under the definition of family violence. So I think that bothers me a little bit because what happens is it then spreads the resources so thin that, if police are out attending to low risk homes, they could potentially miss a call for a high risk home where someone could potentially die. So, you can't keep spreading those resources that thin,
Mhm.
for the sake of capturing everybody just in case.
Yeah, and the classic, of course, is this big push for coercive control. Funnily enough, Tasmania was one of the first states in Australia to introduce this
Mm,
sort of idea of emotional abuse being part of this net. And that was back in 2004. And they didn't have a single person charged for 3 years. And of course, the feminists had a meltdown about that. And they made a lot of fuss to try to get police to act. What did the police tell you about coercive control? Can they get their heads around it, and how
yeah.
else you define it?
Yeah, look, it is one of those difficult things to define, isn't it? And it's really tough for the police. They're doing some extensive training at the moment from an external provider on coercive control, and all frontline police, it's compulsory for them so that they can get their head around this issue. And look, I think it's good to have a coercive control law, but me personally, I think you need to look at that in conjunction with other stuff. You would never get I just don't think it's fair to charge someone just based on manipulation. And certainly if that's the case, you're going to catch a lot more women with that than men. As someone who understands female toxic behavior, women are extremely manipulative and do use coercive control on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But I think that we're still trying to look at just ticking another box for men and ticking another box for going, okay, this is just one more thing men do. But actually, I'm sure if you had a good look, it's women that are probably more manipulative than men in many
Yeah.
ways.
And that's what we've seen with coercive control. Feminists across the country have got very nervous that women will be misidentified as perpetrators,
Mm,
and have tried desperately to stop that. But I'm pleased to see. I mean, I actually was talking to someone who has family members who are in the young people who are in the police force, and these women were female police officers saying that they are charging women with coercive control in New South
mm,
Wales as well. So good to see. I mean, of course, it'll cause a lot of problem for the feminists if too many women get charged,
mm,
because it was all introduced as another means of getting at men. But anyway, one of the things you also talked to me about was the lack of services for male victims. I
mm,
mean, the fact male victims don't exist as far as the feminists are concerned. And
mm.
I think you mentioned a story about a man who was dropped off in the park because the police didn't know what to do with him when he'd been removed from the home.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing, those support services, even if you're a victim, there's not a lot of counselling services, but yeah, I had a police officer recount to me a time where she had to pick up a man and remove him from the home and had nowhere to take him. There was, everywhere was full, so they had to drop him off at the park. And she said to me that that was something that happened quite often. I don't know whether that's recent, or whether it's still happening, but I wouldn't surprise me in the slightest because there's nowhere for them to go. And what happens is if they are extremely violent, they'll just go home again. So, yeah, it's
That's
not.
the perpetrator, but the male victim too.
Oh,
Nowhere, as you know, the services you've been involved in, presumably they never took males as victims, did they?
no, there's no home to take men to where they'd probably put them with other violent men because there's nowhere to put them in terms of as a victim.
And of
Yeah.
course, our major so-called referral services to men pride themselves on working out how many of the men who come forward as claiming to be victims of violence are actually perpetrators.
Mm,
This outrageous situation where men bring up needing help as victims, and the police in some states will get involved in ringing the wives to say this man is claiming to be a victim, which is an outrage. Um,
wow.
you know, anyway, so it goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm really delighted to hear about the work you're doing, Fiona, with in the domestic violence sphere, and the fact that the police seem to be all behind it and seem to be standing up to this pressure to to absolutely distort proper evaluation of domestic violence cases to only
Mm.
charged men. Um, it is really encouraging, and let's hope it continues.
Yeah, and I hope in the near future that I'll actually do some solid research with the Family Violence Specialist Unit so we can actually share some of the data around the important work that they're doing.
Yeah. Just briefly, I want you to talk about the whole issue of your previous work in what we would have called a rape crisis centre. That's what I knew. The sexual assault services used to be called rape crisis centre.
Mm.
But here too, we find it's not just about when you're working there, you certainly found it wasn't just about, women coming in who felt they'd been raped. I mean, I think you mentioned to me that there were people there who'd been coming there for 10 years
Mm.
for counselling at these services. It's not, a crisis centre in that sense, is it?
No, and I think that was a bit of a shock to me. So before I even started managing the local sexual assault service, a few years before I'd done my master's research, sorry, honours research, and I looked at historical victims of sexual assault who had come to the service based on being assaulted as a child, and they were now wanting to get some help. And I had one of the counsellors pull me aside and say to me, because I said, "Oh, look, you're getting an increase in these historical cases coming through." And she said to me, "No, actually, what we're doing is the government doesn't want us to keep people for more than a certain amount of sessions. So what we do is we close them off and we open a new case for them. But, some of these people have been here for 10 years." And I was really quite shocked because it not only skewed my data terribly, but I was like, that's actually not appropriate to use your funding for that purpose. Obviously, now I will, a disclaimer is that it is under new management now and there's a new board, and I'm hoping, I suspect things are being done quite differently now, but certainly my time in that sector was really interesting, and they certainly didn't, I didn't see a lot of people come in that were recently assaulted. It was more a lot of historical stuff, a lot of people who came on going, which really concerned me because they weren't really giving people the tools to manage on their own. Counselling is not about, coming for years on end. You need to be given tools to function. And I think some people just got used to having someone to talk to, and it wasn't really based around the sexual assault they'd experienced. So, yeah, it was a little bit concerning.
I mean, it is worrying, this misuse of government funding. And I mean, I think we'll talk again when we talk about the female psychopathology, but that some of these bosses in this service were very much using their power to, have access to these huge amounts of government funding to push other people around. I mean, that was their power, wasn't it? The use of these funds, yeah.
Yeah, it was. And the feminist board were almost on a power trip, and that's always been my argument about women. I think we are seeing women being more toxic and more violent because they're gaining more power, and with power, you often see people show their true colors. But I certainly saw misuse of funds when I was managing the service. I reported directly to the board, so I got to see everything, and I did try and address it with them, and that was when they came after me. But there's the government does their best to question services and to understand where money's going, but I think it's easy to convince the government funding body to. It's easy to convince them that you're using it appropriately when it may not necessarily be. They might be funding. I know there was someone on the board who funded their own training program and got paid thousands and thousands of dollars to deliver this training Tasmania wide. It never got delivered, but I know the money was paid to her. So,
Yeah. And even the sort of funding that is, the sort of programs they are running, which is about shaming boys in schools and teaching boys about sexual violence and so on. I mean, it's not what I think the community generally would see as appropriate use of money in a sexual assault clinic. I would have thought most people see this as a place for people to go in crisis, to go and have support, and to deal with what I would call real rape, if you like. I mean, cases that most people would think of as sexual assault. Rather, here too, we're seeing a watering down of what is considered sexual assault. I was looking at the statistics on sexual assault in Tasmania, and we've seen we do see increases. In fact, there was Tasmania had rates of sexual assault tripled in the last 4 years, and the big leap upwards came with the Brittany Higgins case. And it's interesting speculating on what went on here. Obviously, I'm sure you would say that it would have encouraged genuine victims to come forward, but it also, we're seeing a real redefinition of what is sexual assault to include behaviours like, oh, I had too much to drink and therefore it must have been sexual assault, or, the watering down of what we regard as this behaviour. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, it was really common to see people come in after there'd been a high profile case of sexual assault reported. And you'd often find people coming in that had never told anyone, that finally felt confident to share their story, and genuine, and I'm talking about genuine victims.
Yeah.
The biggest problem with genuine victims is that there's always a portion of people that are seeking the attention that comes with being a victim. And I think there's always going to be a small portion of people that do that. That's human nature. We see people lie all the time. And it is horrible because it does water down what's happening for the true victims who have spent years holding on to something that's quite traumatic. But it is common to make more people come forward. But I think when there's a lot of attention given to victims of abuse, I think it's lovely and empowering for them, but then it also feeds into people that may not necessarily be mentally very well, but want that victim status to get that attention. I mean, you look at the likes of people like Belle Gibson, who claimed to have cancer, and the amount she got out of that money and attention from that process. It's very interesting and very inviting for people who are lonely, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, but as we know, you talk about money. I mean, the victim compensation schemes are just shocking in that you claim to be a victim, you get money. It's never, you don't have to wait till your case is assessed. You don't have to make a report to police. Um, I think that's part of this whole problem of how we are evaluating these cases.
Yeah, and I think, and certainly when there's money involved, you are going to attract people who are being dishonest because if it means they're going to get money out of it, then it's worth being a victim, isn't it? Which is really, really sad and takes away from those true victims that actually deserve that. So, yeah, it's a real problem.
And was that part of the issues you struggled with when you're working in that service? I mean, obviously you had problems with your colleagues, but also, are you genuinely helping the people who need, who most need that attention?
Yeah, there were some, I mean, I didn't work directly with the clients, but I managed the support staff. And often they would come to me and say, look, I've got this client that's not, I know is potentially not being completely honest. And I used to say I hated that narrative, that believe all women narrative, because I think believe those that are telling the truth, but you can't believe everyone because not everyone's honest. I mean, what world do you live in that you think every single woman is being honest about her experience? So I was always very allowed them to be very honest with me about what they were experiencing in the counselling room. But also to be able to name up those people that were clearly just continuing to come because they needed a friend or someone to talk to. And that was really obvious as well because it was free.
But the culture in the clinic was believe all women generally, was it?
Certainly from a board perspective, the staff were amazing. They were an amazing group of women who didn't, not all of them, not all of them lived by that narrative, no.
Yeah.
I think, there was some really intelligent, well-educated women that I worked with that didn't always feel that same way about the people they were working with. Not
Yeah.
all of them, but certainly some of them were willing to go, actually, no, we shouldn't believe everyone that comes in.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's very enlightening. I'm sure people listening to this, Fiona, will be delighted to hear that there are people like you out there fighting the good fight and telling the truth about these important areas, and being willing to expose the problems we're having with ideological, pressure on our services to not address who are the real victims, but to essentially weaponize, domestic violence and sexual assault charges entirely against men.
Mm. Yeah, because the narrative is believe all women, it's easy to do. If you really are pissed off at your partner or your ex and you want to make them pay, it's really simple to throw someone under the bus with these allegations, and it happens. I mean, you've seen a lot of that yourself, so in
Yeah.
your work.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Fiona. I will, as I say, we will follow this up because I'd like to talk to you one day about your fascinating PhD on female psychopathology.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. Happy to join you again sometime.